Okay, we're back. We're going to talk about the volume variance of overhead. And what I decided to do is illustrate this not in the textbook slides that I have for you, although we may come back to that, but first illustrate that on a blank sheet of paper of what the volume variance and overhead is really all about. First, we have to look at, we had an original budget based on a certain budgeted amount of volume for overhead. We figured out what the total overhead cost would be. It was consisted of a variable portion, and we figured that out at the volume budgeted. And then we had a fixed portion, and that is what it is. That number came out to be 10,000 based on the volume budgeted, and this was 15,000 regardless of the volume. So we have 25,000 of total overhead, and that we need an application rate, so we take the amount of overhead, 25,000, divided by the expected number of units to be produced, and we get a rate. And what happens in the books and records is that as we produce, we apply the $50 rate as part of the overhead cost, since that's what we came up with in our original budget. Okay, that's pretty cool. And then what happens is that in the flexible budget, what we do is we say, oh, okay, well, we know we're applying $50 per unit based on the original budget, but you know what? Our production went down to 450. So that means that, that's not a dollar sign, sorry about that. It's 450 units. That means that our budgeted overhead should be different. It should have been a different amount. In fact, what it should have been is 15K fixed plus $20 on the variable part of the overhead. That's the variable portion. $20 times 450, and that number is $9,000. So the total overhead should have, instead of being 25K, as we saw on the slide before this, would have been 24K. That's why it's called a flexible budget, because we're flexing the budget to the actual units. And so if we had applied overhead at the flexible budget amount, we'd apply enough overhead to cover what we budgeted the overhead to really be, the 24,000. Let's illustrate this one further step, which is the following. Originally, we thought we were going to have 500 units. So our unit price for overhead came out to $50 per unit. So if we apply $50 per unit to the units as we go along, and we get up to 500 units, we'll cover our 25K budgeted that we had in it for overhead. But if we only get up to 450 units, if we only get up that far, then the amount that we'll have applied would be 22,500. We're not applying the full amount of dollars that is really running in overhead, because we're applying it at a higher unit. It's true, it's a higher per unit. It isn't a higher per unit. It's 50, whatever it is. It's a $50 per unit, but it's being applied to a lower number of actual produced units. So the application isn't complete to get up to the 25K that we budgeted. Meanwhile, with the flexible budget, what happens there is, since we assume 450 units, then we would have had, as a rate, we would have had, first of all, 15K would have been we just did this before, 15K is the fixed, 9K would have been the variable, that's 24, over 450 units, and our application rate would have been, let's do the math, where's my calculator? Here it is. Oh, it's not on. Turn it on. So we would have had $24,000. This should be 24K, in case you're wondering. 24,000K over 450 units, and that would have been $53.33 per unit would have been the amount of overhead applied, because we have just less units, so it's got to be more dollars per unit to apply to each unit to cover the overhead. So since you can see now what's going to happen, or what has to happen, since the A here is at $50 per unit and the B here is at $53.33, it looks like that our overhead costs per unit has gone up, leading to a unfavorable result in our volume because we got less volume. So the volume variance really doesn't tell you a whole lot except what you would expect, and that is if you have less units produced, it's going to have an unfavorable result. If you have more units produced, it'll have a favorable result because the more units produced, you get to spread the overhead out over more units, and so the unit volume for more units produced, then you expect it will be a lower unit cost, lower per unit, which would be favorable. So it doesn't really tell you a whole lot. Still, the textbook goes into what kind of analysis you can do, and you should check that out. Let's go back to the actual slides and see if we see what we have, what I might want to say that we haven't said, but let's see if we can follow the slides now that we went through that explanation. So the volume variance is comparing, just as we said, the flexible budget amount to the overhead as applied using the original budget. Here's the original budget per unit. Take a look at that. Same things that we just did. Back to the textbook over here. The flexible budget changes the amount per unit to that, and just as we said, here's the amount applied, but because we got less units, we're going to say this is an unfavorable result because our real flexible budget amount is 24,000 compared to the amount that we actually applied. So it'll be considered unfavorable, but it doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. You have to look at it and analyze it and let's see how the textbook says to interpret the overhead volume variance. Let's see what it says. Volume variance is not single overhead costs are in or out of control. You see that there. The signal is provided by the controllable overhead variance discussed earlier. Okay, that's great, so throw this away. Well, we can't throw it away yet. An overhead volume variance, reading over here, simply signals that the quantity of production was greater or less. Okay. Tell me something already. Tell me something. All right, maybe I got to erase something to see. All right, so let's see what else it says. When more units are produced than anticipated, the amount of overhead applied to them exceeds the flexible budget because the amount of fixed cost per unit is being applied to more units than anticipated. So that'll result in a favorable variance, and you should understand why, or you should think about that and make sure you understand why. So far it's proving my point that the volume variance doesn't tell us a whole lot, but it does go into the equation of figuring out what the total overhead variance is. I'll go back to that in a minute. This shows the math that I just did, that the flexible budget would have been at that. That would have been the standard overhead rate had we adjusted the budget for the 450 units. And this basically sums up the math we've already done. Now I see the paragraph I'm really looking for, which, what is the doggone usefulness of the volume variance? I'll come back to my other thought in a minute, but let's see what the textbook says. It's limited. That's what it is. It signals only that more or fewer units have been produced than planned. Oh, great. Turn this tape off. Well, not yet. Wait one more second. Okay, so it's limited. But and when you want to and read this part in your textbook, it's really just things we've already learned, which is calculating things on incremental analysis, but make sure you read it and understand in case there's a question on the quiz about that. But to go back, why do we need the volume variance overall? It goes back to the big picture. If you want to know what the total overhead variance is, it's a combination of the two parts. It's a combination of the controllable and the volume variance. So that's why we still need to know, even though it's of limited use, the volume variance, we still need to know what it is. If we were, let's say, given a problem, I'll describe this. Let's say we're given a problem where they told you what the total overhead variance was, and they told you what the volume variance was. And then they asked you, what is the controllable variance? And you might sit there scratching your head, thinking, how am I supposed to know that? Well, A and B here, A plus B, is the total overhead variance. Okay, that and a cup of coffee. get you to the end of this tape, and we'll retake this up Saturday night and get emails out to you then.